Thank you very much for introduction. And I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. How wonderful was the food? Compliments to the chefs. Thank you very much for organizing it. So it was really a good example of traditional Mediterranean diet. So in our next session, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about traditional Mediterranean diet, specific component of Mediterranean diet which make it so good for our health, and the implication in food production. And the implication on food production. All right. So let's have a look at traditional Mediterranean diet. By the way, some of this information you probably know, some of this you might don't, some of this you maybe never heard in English, so hopefully everyone will learn something out of this session. So the traditions of Mediterranean diet stretch back over millennia, and they're based on diverse variations of various traditions and dietary patterns of the countries surrounding Mediterranean basin. And it's interesting that historians consider, of course, this region as a cradle of civilization. The diet in Mediterranean basin is considered by historians as a construct of progressively evolved cultures and traditions. It really is a melting pot of variety of way of living and way of eating developed over the long period of time. It's interesting that Mediterranean diet, it's not the way we eat, it's the way we are. And it's no coincidence that the very word diet derives from a Greek word diati, which means way of life or way of living. And this describes absolutely perfectly that approach to food and eating and living in the Mediterranean. Some of the earliest descriptions of Mediterranean diet come to us from the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato, so 5 centuries before Christ, BC. And he described diet common in Mediterranean region as something consisting of cereals, legumes, fruit, milk, honey, fish, and water. He also suggested that meat, sweets, and wine should be only considered in very moderate quantities. In Greece and Rome, bread, wine, and olive were 3 staples of the diet. And these were complemented by some additional foods, such as sheep cheese or some vegetables. Most of the vegetables were actually forage, so they were wild-growing lettuces, leeks, mushrooms, and very, very small amounts of meat. One of the significant influence on historical formation of Mediterranean diet is contribution made by Arabic and Islamic cultures. And some authors actually suggest that it's because of that influence of Arabic and Islamic cultures and cuisines, Mediterranean diet became so rich in vegetables and legumes too. Another interesting influence on the Mediterranean diet was discovery of the Americas. So when Christopher Columbus went into his voyages and brought all the new food and plants into Mediterranean, such as, for example, tomato or potato or capsicum, it's quite interesting to think that tomato, which we think is so Mediterranean, only became Mediterranean a few centuries ago. So Mediterranean diet really is a melting pot of cultures and religions and human endeavors. In 2010, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization actually recognized the Mediterranean diet as intangible cultural heritage. It described Mediterranean diet as social practice based on a set of skills, knowledge, practices, and traditions ranging from the landscape to the culture and cuisine. So traditional Mediterranean way of living was built around the land and practices on the land. It was about growing local crops and very wide variety of different fruit and vegetables and cereals. Many ancient varieties of crops and wide heritage through land and through produce was basically developed and continued through generation. There was enormous respect for land, for plants, and for production. Many practices such as smart crop rotation and resting and companion of different crops, which we don't do these days, that's all was very much observed and passed on through generation to generation. There's few principles of Mediterranean diet which define Mediterranean diet apart from any other diet or way of eating. So Mediterranean diet is essentially a plant-based diet. So it's grains, legumes, and vegetables. Extra virgin olive oil, which is usually mechanically pressed, and it makes it very rich in polyphenols, is a main source of fat. Onion, garlic, and tomato base of many dishes. Many dishes in Mediterranean start with onion, garlic, and tomato. That's how I cook. I start with onion, garlic, and tomato, and then throw in whatever I have in the house. So herbs and spices are used for seasoning. So a lot of herbs and spices and a lot of wild growing plants. So nuts, honey, dry fruit used as sweets. So there's essentially no added sugar whatsoever. Water is a main drink, or maybe herbal tea, again, made with wild plants quite often. Sorry, not wild plants. So when dairy is consumed, milk is reserved for children, whereas adults usually consume fermented dairy. And meat, of course, in a very small amounts, every now and then, and it's usually seafood, sheep, or goat. Culinary and psychosocial elements are very important in Mediterranean diet as well. For example, food is usually cooked at home or prepared by family and friends. Traditional cooking methods used, so high moisture and low temperature, such as stewing. When you think about it, it's like one pot cooking. If you ever cook or ate with your grandparents, that's how they would cook, in one pot. So everything cooked in one pot. Quite often now when we eat, different bits of our meal prepared all over the country, sometimes all over the world, and then combined. So it's probably not the best way of eating. Also, meals usually consumed with other people, so very slowly, very mindfully. No one eats in the way from work in their car. People come together at the table, sit down, and enjoy a meal together. Interestingly, snacking is actually not common in, or never was common in traditional Mediterranean diet. So usually it's main meals. Fasting or abstaining from meat due to cultural reasons, particularly in Orthodox Church, of course, was common as well. Mostly people ate locally grown produce, and it was a lot of bartering system. So people, if someone next door grew one crop, people would exchange, and everyone had everything locally grown. And staple foods and combinations such as olives and yogurts and salsas and sofrita were consumed pretty much every day. One good thing was siesta, or rest after main meal. Would be nice to have right now. So you saw that quite a few times today, this pyramid. So essentially, when you look at the ratio of plant versus animal food, a traditional Mediterranean diet presents as semi-vegetarian. So it's not really vegetarian, it is a semi-vegetarian with abundance of those unrefined plants. And very notable absence of any ultra-processed foods. However, in recent years, there were significant changes with the shift towards Western-style diet everywhere in the world, really. modern food system is a very far cry from traditional Mediterranean diet or many other traditional diets and way of eating and living. So we know that high population density in the cities and depopulation of rural areas actually dramatically reduce the availability of local grown crops. We have now massive industrial scale food production of monocrops. So instead of gardens which would grow maybe 30, 40 various plants, we have monocrops. So we have also globalization of the food market. So we understand that, or we see that big international companies have emerged, increasing the food availability, particularly for the developed world, and completely monopolizing the market. We have incredibly user relationship with plants and animals and the land. We use the land, we use animals until we can use it no more. We lose, Joel was talking about the diversity of plants and how we lost that diversity in folds. That loss of diversity in plants and in land and animals basically impacts the loss of diversity for our food, but also for our microbiome as well. And we're driven by convenience and by fast approach to food. So food companies quite often say that they only reflect what consumer wants. But it's a very clever manipulation of consumers as well for us to want that fast and convenient way of eating. We don't have, no longer families don't really sit down together to eat. They don't cook traditionally, as I was talking about. No one, that's very rarely grandparents teaching their grandchildren how to cook or how to eat together. So for us, for people who study food or produce food, there's clear need for innovative food environment, for that balance between traditional Mediterranean diet and modern lifestyle demand. So Andriana, I think, was describing, as far as I could understand, perfectly, that's what he's doing with his bread production. Those modern way of producing stuff based on quite a traditional way of producing food too. And that's what we need to think about. Let's have a closer look at some components of traditional Mediterranean diet. What makes it so good? And at the same time, let's consider, when we're discussing food production, using Mediterranean dietary principles and how it might impact these good components of Mediterranean diet. Well, one could argue, but for me, the most important components in Mediterranean diet, in traditional Mediterranean diet, are a variety of plants and fibers, polyphenols and other phytochemicals, good fats, and fermented foods. Let's start with, oh, sorry, I'm not sure what's happening there. Let's start with variety of plants and fibers. Okay, that's an interesting change. So quick reminder for us what fiber is. Of course, fiber is non-absorbent part of plant carbohydrates, and usually it's cell wall of the plants. Dietary fiber is a part of plant matrix. It's so, for example, fibers are content of oats or potato. There are many various types of fiber, and that they could be basically grouped by their functional capacity to impact human health. We're not going to go into great details, but I think everyone is aware that fiber and consumption of fiber is absolutely essential for our physical health, but also for our mental well-being through that gut-brain connection. Unfortunately, majority of us don't consume enough fiber at all. Joel was saying that traditionally Mediterranean basin consume about 50 to 100 grams of fiber per day. In France, he mentioned 20 grams, Felice, is that right, Joel said?
Yeah.
Yeah, majority of Australians don't get that, even close to that. It's about 15 grams of fiber. So we essentially don't eat enough fiber. Consuming variety of plants also mean consuming variety of prebiotics. So quick reminder to us all that prebiotics are special type of fiber or substrates that are selectively utilized by health benefiting host microorganisms. Basically, if all fibers are food for gut microbes, prebiotics are most loved ones, so they really do love prebiotics, and they're good for good gut microbes. Prebiotics provide health benefits by impacting and changing either composition of gut microbiota or function of gut microbiota. And you remember Joel was talking about that RCT, where they created special bread and fed people special bread, and how although there wasn't a variety, increase of variety of gut microbiota, the function of gut microbiota changed after that, after introduction of variety of fiber. So that's quite important to remember. So unlike fiber, prebiotics really are a more recent addition to the nutrition and health science. These have been studied for certain health effects, such as reduction of infection and the cardiometabolic health as well. Important to understand that all plants essentially contain some prebiotic fibers, but some types, such as onion and garlic and leeks and oats and apples, are particularly great source of prebiotics, which are loved by those good bugs. And of course, these foods are staples of Mediterranean diet. Traditionally, in Mediterranean diet, people would consume a very, very, very high amount of raw vegetables. Majority of food eaten was kind of raw or just slightly cooked. So salads and snacks. If meals are cooked, all juice are retained. It's how I'm keep talking about one kind of pot cooking methods, when everything retained in one pot. You don't cook and discard all the juices and sauces. You eat all together. Usually people also in Mediterranean and in many other traditional diets consume whole plants, so skin and seeds, not juices, because when we have juices, although they're very tasty and palatable and sweet and fun, they really don't have all the fibers and everything else we need in them. So when we think about if we try to create something new or start our food company, it's a great idea to kind of have foods with variety of raw ingredients. Have you noticed when we were eating today, there were some cooked dishes with addition of raw stuff in, like cauliflower had some raspberries in. That's your raw food you consuming all together. Various temperatures such as cooking and freezing and defrosting have less impact on most fibers, including prebiotics. I'm not going to go into resistant starches because it's a slightly different topic. So whatever you do with your vegetables, long as you eat them, it's not going to impact fiber or prebiotics. It will have impact, cooking methods will have impact, of course, on micronutrients, phytochemicals, and the environment too. So it's good to eat raw just for the environment side. So let's have a look at those polyphenols or phytochemicals. You heard that a few times today. So basically, phytochemicals are plant-produced chemicals that are fundamental for plants' growth, reproduction, and defense against environmental harm, such as microorganisms and insects. There are great amount of classified phytochemicals and even greater amount of unclassified phytochemicals. It really is a relatively novel concept. So flavonols are large group of phytochemicals. It's about 800 various of, sorry, not flavonols, polyphenols. I was looking at Anna and we were discussing flavonols and I said flavonols, but I meant polyphenols. So polyphenols, it's quite a large group of phytochemicals, about 800 that we know are there. That is absolutely key for plant defense and by default provide fantastic antioxidant properties to humans who consume those plants. So we understand that polyphenols in particular and phytochemicals have been attributed with a diverse array of health benefits. And because Mediterranean diet is essentially a plant-based diet, phytochemicals are considered to be major contributors to the overall health benefits which are associated with Mediterranean diet. Thermal processing of food, also known as cooking, actually have a significant impact on antioxidant capacity due to that thermal degradation. We understand that there's quite a bit of antioxidants and formation of pro-oxidant compounds can occur during cooking, particularly when we cook at high temperatures. So consuming a range of raw plants is a great idea. And when we look at traditional ways, say, people in Greece ate, salads were found to consume pretty much every day, twice a day. So majority of food was consumed raw, plus all the fantastic dressings made with herbs and juices, lemon juice, and extra virgin olive oil. Although fresh is the best, it's a lot we don't know about polyphenols, and we discussed it with Felice yesterday that it sometimes can be quite confusing because some of the studies showed us that, for example, stewing increases carotenoids by 36%. So carotenoids is one of the type of polyphenols. So when you stew, say, carrots or tomatoes, it actually increases amount of those those phytochemicals. However, if we fry the same food, it decreases the amount of phytochemicals. So it's, you know, when you think about traditional ways of cooking, slow simmering in one pot under the lid, that's probably the best way to go. Because phytochemicals are usually bound to the food matrix, we also understand that chopping and blending and crushing some of the vegetables, for example, garlic, could actually help release them from matrix. So when you look at traditional dishes, particularly, say, Spanish dishes, majority of them made with a crushed garlic, not cut garlic. So there might be some implications there. Another key feature of traditional Mediterranean diet is, of course, high consumption of fat. Overall, the main sources of so-called good fats in the Mediterranean diet are olives, olive oil, nuts, and fish. It does vary quite enormously between regions and cultures of the Mediterranean. For example, in Greece, consumption of olive oil is very, very high. It's around 20 kilograms per person per year. 20 kilograms. Interestingly, in France, even in southern regions of France, it's much lower. It's about 12% of that. In African countries such as Egypt, the consumption of olive oil is also smaller or less, but consumption of grain is much higher. Looking closer at olive oil, particularly at extra virgin olive oil and whole olives, we'll see these two foods are very known for their fantastic anti-inflammatory capacity. Both olives and olive oil are packed with antioxidants, polyphenols. You heard about them already. But concentration of total polyphenols in olive oil can vary dramatically, from about 50 to 800 milligrams per kilo. And it's very much dependent on region, on production methods, on harvesting methods. You know how we were talking in traditional Mediterranean way of harvesting. Everything was harvested at the time, basically. So at the prime of condition. Right now, because we produce food in such enormous amounts, quite often everything is harvested when it's convenient to harvest. For example, there's a way of maturing olives. It's called California style of maturing olives, when green olives are submerged in basically chemical solution to make them that nice kind of dark color. So these olives pretty much do not have any polyphenols because the way they matured. So it's very much depends on the harvesting and growing ways. That's going to impact the amount of polyphenols. Consumption of nuts also have health benefits, especially consumption of nuts being reduced to, being linked to reducing cardiovascular risk and also all-cause mortality, particularly when we look at traditional Mediterranean nuts. So not peanuts, but nuts such as walnuts and almonds and hazelnuts. Nuts not only a great source of unsaturated fatty acids, but also protein, of course, minerals, fiber, and vitamins. Nuts are also packed with antioxidants. And another source of Mediterranean or fat in Mediterranean diet is fatty fish. Interesting facts here for you. In recent years, fish is accounted for about 70% of animal proteins consumed worldwide, and about 7% of all proteins. Seafood feeds sustainably more or less about 3 billion people on the planet. In the past 10 years, majority of seafood we consume is actually produced on the seafood farms, in the fish farms. So we consume more farmed fish than wild-caught fish and other seafood. And we understand that given that we know that the sources of seafood in the ocean quite limited, it's going to actually continue to increase. Fish is, of course, the major source of polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-3. So also proteins called immunoglobulins. Consumption of fish, particularly fatty fish, such as mackerel and sardines and herrings, had been linked to decrease of cardiovascular risk, but it's also said to have great anti-inflammatory capacity. Current guidelines, for example, actually recommend omega-3 supplements as a possible treatment for mild depression. As far as olive oil goes, I mentioned before the harvesting and extraction method have the greatest impact on the final product, particularly in terms of those polyphenols and other phytochemicals. In terms of olives, varieties such as Kalamata have a highest amount of polyphenols, long as they're not Californian-style Kalamata olives, which been then browned in a chemical solution. When we include olive oil in food preparation and cooking, the methods of cooking would have a great impact on composition of the product. We understand that more gentle way of cooking, such as boiling and steaming and baking, is a better approach. But overall, the temperature and duration will have the biggest impact. So the higher temperature and the longer you cook, the more it's going to impact polyphenols and other phytochemicals components of olive oil. Fatty acids are more stable in cooking. However, they might oxidate in storage. That's why olive oil comes usually in those dark bottles. Interestingly, extra virgin olive oil, when used in cooking in sauces such as sofrita, improve the availability of bioactive compounds, including polyphenols. Remember how I was talking about that when you cook, say, tomato, carotenoids amount usually increases. So when you cook that in olive oil also provides a stable environment for polyphenols, so they oxidate less and the lower in the slow rates and in the lower amounts. Olive oil, of course, has very low proportion of water, so it protects other foods from spoilage. So, you know, like if you put something in a jar, pour olive oil over, it's going to be stable without even need for, say, fridge. So olive oil provides fantastic, very natural preservative. Although there are many benefits of olive oil, some people can't get over organoleptic, those taste, smell, and kind of mouthfeel of olive oil. Usually, particularly extra virgin olive oil is quite bitter because it does have a lot of those polyphenols. So in practice, if people ask me, oh, I know I should be eating olive oil, but I don't like the taste. So maybe don't start with extra virgin olive oil. Start with kind of milder varieties. Let's have a look at nuts. So remember how I mentioned that nuts are a great source of fat and phytochemicals such as antioxidants. Important to note that the major source of nuts' total antioxidant capacity is actually in their skin or pellicle. So this little brown kind of on top of the nut. Unfortunately, when we quite often buy nuts, the skin is removed because that's a consumer demands nuts without skin. So a lot of health benefits associated with nuts are actually in that skin. Also, if we say roast nuts, it does change their lipids and phytochemical compositions. However, we don't have enough studies now to understand that although it does change the, say, lipids composition, how it's going to impact human health. We do understand that whole nuts, either unroasted or moderately roasted at lower temperatures, is a better way of consuming nuts. And also, if people in the room who are very innovative, they might think about what to do with pellicle, that removal, that skin of the nuts. I think Felice was talking about one of our researchers in our center who actually developed a supplement based on banana stem. So something which is usually rubbish is kind of, it's not consumed or it's not used in food industry whatsoever. And she actually created potentially highly beneficial supplement. So maybe people in the room can think about what to do with pellicle. So couple words on fish. Even if you didn't know before, I think I mentioned that few times that, for example, environment will have the impact on actual composition of anything, plants or animals or fish. So we understand that fish is very high in omega-3 fatty acids, but particularly fish which is growing in colder water. So they need a little bit more fat to survive, so they have a little bit more omega-3 fatty acids. During cooking, we understand that baking and steaming have the least impact on fatty acids. And because these kind of methods of cooking are usually at the lower temperature. Frying, so deep frying, have the highest impact on availability of omega-3 fatty acids and other polyunsaturated fatty acids. Also, if you deep fry fish, for example, in saturated fatty acids, I didn't know that, they actually penetrate the fish. So if fish fried in saturated fatty acids, you buy that from the store, thinking you're doing good thing, eating yourself a little bit of fish, but instead of polyunsaturated fatty acids, you might be introducing saturated fatty acids. One of the most important implications of fish and seafood production is, of course, issue of sustainability. We need to better understand the variety. There's literally a lot of fish in the sea. Do French have that saying, there's a lot of fish in the sea? There's that saying in English, there's a lot of fish in the sea. There's literally a lot of fish in the sea. However, most of us consume tuna or salmon. We need to understand how other species can actually contribute more sustainably to our everyday eating. For example, carp. You know carp? They're considered as pest fish in Australia. I grew up eating carp. It's pretty good. It's actually constitute about 40% by weight of all world aquaculture production. But only 10% of all existing development programs are actually focused on carp. So should we think about something else? Should we think about maybe introducing carp and recommending carp to eat? We also need to understand that fishery need to be ecosystems, not farming for human consumption. They need to be ecosystems. So I know in Australia that movement about sustainably produced fish is actually quite popular. We have information which fish or seafood is produced sustainably and we can make a choice. I'm not sure if you have that in France. Do you have that information? So we all can make choice what we actually consuming. We also need to have innovative practice in production. For example, we need to understand how to control disease better. Did you know that currently in fish production, all fish get the same treatment? So when fish is growing in the big cages to reduce risk of diseases, they just periodically fed with basically medication. All that impacts, of course, ecosystem. So we need to better way of actually decreasing disease and producing fish in more ecosystem-based approach. And we also need to think about how we feed fish, because a lot of fish grown in captivity is actually fed by seafood, which is captured wildly, which is incredible concept to understand. Although there's some very interesting innovative practices which, for example, use insects or microbes or other single-cell organisms for feeding the fish. Maybe this is something for us to think about too. Talking about microorganisms, let's have a quick chat about fermented foods. It's a favorite topic. It's a favorite topic of Professor Felice Jacka. So I thought I'll talk about fermented foods. Not sure about France. In Australia, in recent years, there was dramatic increase in popularity of fermented foods and consumption of fermented foods. Maybe because Australia is a very hot country and kombucha, you know that fermented drink is super popular in Australia. But of course, fermenting is one of the oldest methods of preserving foods. It's fermentation. It's when food or beverage is produced by controlled fermentation. So it's not something goes moldy in your fridge. It's something which you actually want to ferment. There's a lot of wild ferments, such as kimchi and sauerkraut we produce at home, and then culture-dependent ferments, such as kombucha or natto, which produce at the factory. So here we have 12 different fermented foods, which are very popular and very common in Australia. let's have a count how many of these you consume usually. So 12 all up, we have the yogurt, olives, cheese, wine, kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut, tempeh, natto, miso, kimchi, and sourdough. 12. Felice is counting. Who consuming 12? Not even with wine. No. 11. No? 11. Yes, Australians in the room consume 11. 10. No? 9? Come on. 8? Yay, we have first 8 in the French audience. Well done. 7? 6? Yes, 6. Woohoo. 5? And are they cheese, olives, yogurt, wine, no? And sourdough? No? Are you brave to say what yours? No, Joel and nice. Wonderful. What about you, Joel?
Yeah, I have to say, I do both kefir, kombucha, miso, and sourdough.
Excellent. So it looks like there's a lot of opportunity to introduce fermented foods to French market because they are quite fantastic. And they actually associated with quite a few health benefits too. So it's not just because they're novel or popular or kind of, trendy to eat them. There's a lot of health benefits which actually attributed to fermented foods. For example, various fermentation process increases nutrient availability of the foods. Did you know that? That some of the proteins are more easily available for us to digest once they go through fermentation. Fermented foods also been linked to better gut health because they essentially, a lot of fermented foods come with live bacteria in them. So it helps to recolonize and reproduce our bacteria in the gut. There's also studies linking fermented foods with cardiovascular health, with immune support, and of course, with perceived stress reduction and other mental health benefits due to this gut-brain connection, that bidirectional communication between our gut and different centers in our brain. So fermented foods have all these health promises and more. As I was saying, recently there's a lot of increase in consumer interest. It's a very hot topic in food industry and in various food guidelines as well. Although fermented foods are yet to make an appearance in official recommendations for food consumption, but it's coming. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding because although fermented foods have potential to have a live bacteria in them, it doesn't mean that all of them do, and it also doesn't mean that all live bacteria in fermented foods are probiotics. Those live bacteria which were specifically linked to health benefits. So there's a lot of misinformation because we really don't have a tight regulation around fermented foods. So there is a fantastic opportunity to increase food diversity. There's fantastic opportunity to create functional foods or so-called psychobiotics. And Felice mentioned about study we're doing in our center with kefir. And my colleague Wolf Mark's going to be talking about that study in the next presentation as well. But we do understand that microbial composition varies dramatically, and we do need a lot of testing in production and also a better reporting around fermented foods to understand how exactly we can use them for health benefits. So a couple take-home messages from me. When you're developing food or recipes or even cooking at home, please consider variety, locality, and seasonability. Think about impact of preparation on health-related components. So think about how you prepare your food. It's great to have a wide variety of vegetables, but try to consume a lot of them raw or cook them in one pot. We do need to have more practices and requirements and policies to improve our current food system and to make sure that we preserve fantastic approaches to food and to living, such as in traditional Mediterranean diet. And of course, we need to think about sustainability and innovative approach. That's why I didn't understand everything. Adriana, sorry. The baker. Yeah, I didn't understand everything what he said, but I have a feeling he said all the right things. So we need more people like him. We do in Food and Mood Academy, which I'm a director of, which we provide some food consultancy, and we work with food producers exactly on this, on how to develop food which actually gonna have some health benefits. So if you want to get in touch, please send us an email. And let's try to find a balance between traditional Mediterranean and all other wonderful ways of eating and modern lifestyle demand. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tetyana, for wonderful presentation, strongly supporting the beneficial effect of Western diet over Western diet on health and brain health. I have just a naive question regarding fermented food. In general population subject to take medication for the management of a given medical condition. Do we know the impact of the consumption of fermented food on the pharmacokinetic properties of medication?
So you mean if consumed together, does one reduce another one?
Okay.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure. I understand that fermented foods, of course, is a very good way of introducing bacteria and all bacterial metabolites into your gastrointestinal system. So particularly, I know that some of the recommendations in Australia include for people who say consume the course of antibiotics than to take some probiotics. So if people don't want to take probiotics, they could consider fermented foods with live bacteria in it. We actually also, my research stems into area of eating disorders, particularly restrictive eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa. And we actually recommend fermented foods in treatment of anorexia nervosa to actually improve gut diversity, improve gastrointestinal symptoms, but also provide probiotics, prebiotics, and all these wonderful nutritional concoctions which come in fermented foods.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have another question. I am sorry. No. I have another question. Do we know, in fact, the mechanism underlying the anti-inflammatory, anti-oxidative property of Mediterranean diet?
There's a lot of them, yes.
But yeah.
So if you have 3 to 4 hours, we can have a
Okay. Okay.
Which got all of this. Why Cecile kindly put in the next presentation on, I forgot to mention something which I found very, very interesting. And yesterday I asked Felice and Marion that question, and they didn't know. Do you know why olive tree branch is a symbol of peace? Who knows?
Because of Athena.
Yes, very good.
Intelligence partners.
Yep.
She offered the olive tree to the Greek of Athens.
Excellent.
For Poseidon, only offered a horse.
Yeah.
And
That's
offered to some for agriculture. Some de charbon. That's why they decided, the Greek, to keep Arsenal as their only goddess.
Excellent.
Because
Great
it was a little
explanation.
bit,
Great explanation.
No, I was just thinking of the Bible, but maybe
So looking more into food production, so did you know that traditionally, now we have different varieties and different selection of plants, but traditionally olive trees would take about 30 years to establish and to produce crop. So they never been planted in a time of instability. So this is why branches is actually a symbol of peace and stability. So I thought this was interesting, and that's what I pass on.
Thank you. Thank you.